Hi, everyone. I'm a sector specialist for screen and broadcasts for Expo North. Really want to welcome you to today's workshop. Ode, we're so happy to have you here. Dr. Ode Leginik is a design anthropologist, which I pretty much think is one of the coolest titles I've ever heard. She has a background in museum curation with a focus on textile and heritage. We're here today, as Ollie said, to talk about heritage as a creative future. Just want to let everyone know before I hand it off to Ode. There is a chat box for those who haven't participated in something like this before. There's a chat box at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to submit questions even throughout the session. And at the very end, we will have a Q&A. I'll be reading out your questions to Ode. And you can ask her directly about follow-up things that way. So Ode, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jessica. That's really a pleasure to be with you again, guys, and to speak today about the heritage as a creative future. This is the first of a series of 5 webinars where we're going to discuss alternative ways to utilize the heritage in the creative industries, and also to foster the articulation between the heritage sector and the creative industries, reinforce the links between both, and see how we can be inspired by the objects from the past, the most iconic and emblematic artifacts to create alternative designs. So I'm really happy to be here today. And of course, we will go through my presentation first, which is very much an introduction of the concept of heritage as a creative future and all the mechanisms that might be involved in this approach of heritage. And then the other webinars will go in more depth into the details of this program. Right, so I think that it's really important to think about how to use the heritage in a different way, especially in Scotland, where everything is about history, everything is about the past. When you go outside, you walk, and you're submerged into a flow of history and histories and stories. And your imagination is buzzing with all this very vibrant past. And I think that the most simple way to create from this past would be to copy it and paste it and reproduce the Macintosh chair and reproduce the tartan that have always been woven in the Scottish mills. But maybe we could do something a little bit different and think about the savoir-faire, think about the objects themselves, think about the stories that they bring and the legacy that we would like to create in Scotland, but also somewhere else, of course, and in all the creative industries. Yeah, so let's go into this journey together. So maybe we could start with the first slide. Thank you, Jessica. Yeah, so when I started thinking about this series of webinars, this is also the moment where I have I have watched the podcast with Arne and Carlos, who are very creative knitters from Norway, and I have started also knitting their Christmas balls. And what is quite interesting in the knitting of Christmas balls using Arne and Carlos' approach is that you're actually taking the techniques of Norway's knitwear and producing a Christmas ball which is connected to their heritage, the festive Christmas Norway Christmas trees. So it's connected to this heritage, but at the same time, why would you knit a Christmas ball? You know, so you're using a technique which is the knitting technique, and producing an object, a Christmas ball, which is connected to the heritage of Norway and to the heritage of the global north. Um, and it's actually going a step beyond into the analysis of the savoir-faire, the how-to of a country, of a culture, and connecting that to another object which is also related to this culture, but in a different way. So it was this quite an unexpected approach of the heritage, which has driven my way through the reflection around this notion of heritage and future creation. Actually, you would think, why is heritage a resource for the creation when actually the inspirations can come from everywhere? Why would you create from the past when the creation is turned towards the future? It's forward thinking, it's innovative. So why would you ideate from past creations, and how could you do that in a more sophisticated way than solely the copy and paste? Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So from Christmas balls to vintage port, I have been looking at the concept of vintage, because obviously when you speak about vintage fashion today, for everybody, it's like taking out from your wardrobe an old a creation from back in the day, in the 70s, in 1970s, 1980s, or even before, and wearing it today as a treasure that you are cherishing because it's coming from the past. Actually, the word vintage comes from the French vendange, and it's related to the creation of a very good wine, a millésime, from the best grapes of the terroir. And I think that we can keep in mind this definition, because with this creation of vintage wines, vintage ports, you suddenly realize that the quality, the terroir, the identity, the legacy, the culture is valued. And I would say that with the notion of vintage, we acknowledge the fact that the old, the old objects, the objects from the past are valued, but also the stories, also the techniques from the past. So basically, from the Christmas balls to the vintage part, I have been looking at ways to create differently and have a more analytical approach of this heritage. Actually, creating from the past, if it seems something quite something related to our contemporary culture, is not new. And if we go to the next slide, please, you will see that it's absolutely not a recent phenomenon. This phenomenon of vintage design, vintage wine, vintage objects is not new. In the 19th century, for example, there was a trend for neo-Greek features and designs. And it was said that, for example, in Paris, at the beginning of the 19th century, everybody was dressed à la grecque. So, tout Paris est à la grecque. So the entire Paris city is Greek. And that was to refer to the antiquity that was really inspiring at this point in time in all areas of design. So you can see here, for example, an Etruscan hairstyle and a Greek tunic, which were very fashionable in 1801 in Paris. And that's an engraving from Costume Parisien, which was a very trendy fashion plate, fashion magazine of the time. Of course, the brothers Adam have been strongly inspired by all the features from the Greek antiquity, and that's something that in Scotland has inspired most of the architecture and interior design at the end of the 18th century. And this has lasted, of course, all through the 19th century, as you can see from the dining room of Theodore Roosevelt, where everything is so eclectic, everything is inspired, imbued by this past design. Can I have this next slide, please? So how can the ideation from the styles of the past happen? As I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, you can go through a process of copy and paste, which is something that we can identify most of the time in the re-edition of past collections. For example, the trench coat here from Burberry. And you can also identify a lot of re-editions of furnitures. For example, Charlotte Perriand has been copied and a lot, and especially by the Corner and Shop in their reproduction of the Berger stool. To refer to the Scottish industry, you've got this very strong revival of Scottish linoleum. And what is interesting here is that they're using sometimes digital printing to reproduce the effect of a vintage linoleum instead of using the actual technique. So it's an image of what could have been produced in the past, but it's a reproduction, of the features as it could have happened in the 19th century, beginning of 20th century. The vintage trainers, of course, Puma has reproduced these trainers called Roma 68, which are vintage trainers, examples of shoes that have been produced back in the day. And sometimes it goes to such an extent that the interior design itself is a total reproduction from the past. And this is something that has really been explored by some controversial people, such as in Bucharest, Ceausescu, when he's created the Palace of the Parliament, has taken all the features from the French Second Empire, like he's copied the opera and all the main buildings to create this ballroom and all the other rooms of his actual building. What has been complicated here is to include within this interior design the modern comfort of a 20th century palace, so electricity, air conditioned, and all of that, which has led to a series of needed accommodations in the palace. Can I have the next slide, please? And of course, to follow up on this extreme example of copy and paste, which you can identify in this type or this category of interior design, the fashion industry has also got the strong illustrations of what has been produced sometimes as a fashion faux pas by some of the major brands in haute couture and ready to wear. So this is an example here of Prada. Prada has been, so that's an Italian fashion brand, of course, and they've been extremely good at copying and pasting back in the 2010s. What they've been doing at this time, because vintage was so trendy, they've been using the fashion plates and fashion magazines of the 1950s, 1960s. Um, but instead of looking at the dresses which were photographed in these old fashioned magazines, they've actually taken the pictures, the black and white photographs, as an inspiration for their creations. For example, in these photographs from 1953 from the Harper's Bazaar, the dress seems here in seems like a black and white dress, but it could have been like purple and yellow, and the effect would have been the same on a black and white photograph. But what Prada designers have been doing here, they've taken the black and white interpretation of this outfit and created this red and black, sepia, black and white series of outfits to go on the catwalk in autumn winter 2010. So it's here quite awkward interpretation of the past, where you don't actually look at the object, but you interpret the interpretation of these objects in past archives. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. And of course, if you do that, you are sometimes facing a lot of problems and issues. For example, copyright issues. And this has been the case for Chanel. Chanel is really keen in their catwalk shows, which are called the Défilé des métiers d'art, to take the savoir-faire, the how-tos of a territory, and create from the mills, from the craft workers, to create from their from these techniques, sorry, to create from these techniques and reproduce the techniques from the past in quite outstanding collections. So every season, every November, they go in a specific place to showcase the value of this savoir-faire. And what has happened in 2016, they've copied and pasted ferile patterns which had been created by the designer, knitwear designer Mathieu Ventrillon. And they've copied them a little too much, really, which has led them to be sued by Mathieu Ventrillon and had led to a real formal apology from Chanel for doing this kind of thing. So, of course, what they are doing very well in some of their interpretation of the heritage of the identities of the textile and fashion savoir-faire in places such as 2012 for their défilé in Linlithgow, Scotland, sometimes has led them to a faux pas, a completely awkward interpretation and a lack of consideration in terms of copyright which has questioned the cultural appropriation of these patterns. So being inspired by the heritage, being inspired by the past, doesn't mean that you need to go systematically into the copy and paste of old heritage patterns or objects from the past. You need to go a step beyond that. Can I have the next slide, please? And this is what you can find. Still examples in the fashion industry. My apologies for people joining from other creative industries here. But this is potentially where you can find the most interesting examples of the forward thinking and further analysis of how to interpret the heritage in very innovative outfits and collections. So Christian Dior himself was extremely interested in the mid 19th century Parisian fashion. And when he's created his innovative tailor suit in 1947, which was the very first of the new look outfits, he has actually reinterpreted the silhouettes of the past, so silhouettes of the 18th century with this very fitted jacket, but also the interpretation that this has had in the mid 19th century fashion. So you can find these lines in the Tailleur Bar. Then Ralph Simons, when he's taken the direction of the artistic direction of Dior around 2015, has started by reinterpreted the creations of Christian Dior. And this, of course, happened through the reinterpretation of the Tailleur Bar, through a complete destructuration of the silhouette. So you can identify the legacy, but this is something that has led towards a much more creative and structural interpretation in Ralph Simons' design. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. In the car industry, designers and users are also very keen at acknowledging their connection with the past. And if you look at the Citroën DS, for example, which was an iconic car from the late 1960s, early 1970s, this DS has been reproduced extremely recently by Citroën designers. And of course, they had to accommodate the necessity of modern cars. They had to comply with the requirements of modern cars. But look, for example, at the line at the side. It's a reflection of the light in the old-fashioned vintage DS, which has been transformed into a metal bar applied at the side of the car on the new version of the DS. So it's quite cleverly interpreted here. And it's also quite interestingly interpreted on their website, where they've reproduced. If you go on Citroën website, you can click on the sound of the car and start the engine of each of the cars of their collections, which mean that the sound itself is part of the magic of the past. It's part of this heritage. And other examples here connected to the sound and the music and the videos. You can add filters. You can use this screechy noise that comes from the listening of an LP. Reintroduce this into the soundtrack of a CD, for example. You can actually use filters to distort the images in a video and makes it look a little bit more vintagey. These are examples of how to use the heritage in a more structural approach in others aspects, others areas of the creative industries. Can I have the next slide, please? The technique, the techniques, the savoir-faire is part of the intangible heritage, which is a signature of our identities. And come back to fashion and textiles. There's been a lot of occurrences where designers have taken this technique and transformed that into a completely astonishing creation. This is the case, for example, with Jean-Paul Gaultier in, I think it was his last défilé in autumn-winter 2015 and 16. He was inspired by Breton embroideries, and he's taken everything from Brittany, from the pancakes to the embroidery, and applied all of that on the shapes of astonishing dresses. So the technique has been reinterpreted, transformed, applied to different shapes. The scale of the patterns has also been reconsidered, and this is the case with the knitwear designer Sandra Blacklund. In this jumper, she's used the cable knitwear techniques, but the scale and the proportion is completely different, which leads to a total transformation of the original aspect of this technique. But it's still an acknowledgement of the connection with the past. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So here in Scotland, you are used, I say you actually, me in the audience, there might be people who are not based in Scotland. So in Scotland, people, creative industries are used to stories and interpretation of stories and storytelling. And this is something that has happened, for example, forever, well, since the 19th century in the tartan industry, where the designers of the tartan have actually worked from the signature of the clan, the culture of a family, the belongings of these families, and the history of these families to create a best ever pattern. With prickly thistles, tomatin tartan, it's here a connection between the taste industries, the whiskey industry, and the textile industry. I think it's a very interesting story where the distillery has has commissioned prickly thistle to produce a tartan which is reflecting not only the name of the owners but the product itself. So the connection is more towards the type of whiskey, the bottles, the core of the bottles, and the color of the whiskey itself to produce a heritage tartan, which is the signature of this brand. Can I have the next slide, please? And of course, the story that you would like to tell, and how and the way you're going to brand your collection and your creations. Sorry. So the story that you would like to tell could be also a fake story. It doesn't have to refer to the true past of a brand. It doesn't have to refer to the very old and old past and reputation, and the reputation of the brand could be created from telling a completely different story and making up this story. This is something that has happened, for example, with the children's wear brand Jacadi. They are based in Paris. They've been created in 1976, and they've been inspired by the capital, by Paris, and the mid 19th century grandeur of Paris. And they've created all their communications and collections around this recreated past, recreated heritage. In a completely different area of the fashion industry, Dolce and Gabbana have branded their creations quite recently by reinforcing the links with the 1950s in Italy. This, of course, is very far away from the story of these designers and the way they've created their collections back in the 1990s. So, from the communication, but also from the design of the outfits, from the collection, you can create a brand platform which will bloom from this reinterpreted past, this to rebrand and gain a real pretend past, which will add some value to the collection. Can I have the next slide, please? Of course, to do that, you industries, creative industries, and museum need to work together. And what we're going to do in this series of webinars is to give you the tools and potentially the ideas and guide you towards the strategy to adopt in order to add some value to the heritage that you have, or to create the story that you would like to tell. Some companies in the UK, for example, have got a long past of creations and they've been working on their archives, such as John Lewis, for example, who has benefited from a digitization campaign recently and can access this heritage of wallpapers and other objects very easily. Some others, like Marks and Spencers, have created an archive thanks to the support of local museums, and have opened their doors to designers designers and ambassadors and guests to recreate past collections, such as Alexa Chung here, for example, in 2016. Some others, like Morton Young and Bolland or Johnson Velgin, have got outstanding archives that they're using regularly in the creation of their designs internally, but would benefit potentially from opening up their doors a bit more in order to let their customers understand this connection with the past. So here we're not looking at outstanding collections and wide-scale projects, but we can also find tools for small museums and more less ambitious collections, but as interesting as others, I would say. So find tools to support a stronger connection between the heritage and the creative industries, the past and the future of the creation, the legacy and the creation and the branding of a collection. This to adds more value to the objects from the past, more value to the current collections, and create a strong sense of identity, a strong sense of belonging, which will be extremely useful for a more sustainable creative industry sector. So I would like to thank you very much for your attention. I apologize for the wee blah blah blah, but things happen. Thank you, and I'm very happy to answer any question now.
Well, thank you so much. That was really interesting. I have a couple of questions. I'm sure the audience does too. And I am conscious of time, so I'd like to put our participants first before my own. So if people feel comfortable, please type a message as I'm talking into the chat box below. We'll get all your questions in. I will begin. You talked a lot about the idea of heritage and storytelling. And in the past, you and I have had conversations about how to kind of be inspired by your own story and your own heritage. Are there questions when you're just starting this journey about looking to the past to inspire the future that you should be asking yourself even before approaching museums or other allies?
Well, um, you would need to ask yourself the importance for your brand, for your company, for your collection to um, create this link with your territory, with your culture, with your identity. Why would you do that? Why would this be part of your journey? Why do you think it's important to add this value coming from the past, coming from the culture and identity of where you are and where you live? Why would you think this would add a value? But also, apart from the why, it's important to reflect on the customer, the user, and how you will bond with them on a different basis than purely selling products. You know, what is the story that you would like to tell them? And if it's a story that will speak to them, then they will have their approach of the object of the product will be completely different, and you will undertake a much more sustainable approach of the creation, really.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And you brought up such an interesting point when you looked at the Fair Isle jumper and Chanel and the outcome of that. I thought that story was so interesting. So when you are borrowing from the past, you used a word, but that kind of not taking a very literal copy and paste translation, but being inspired by it. Are there other safeguards to be just aware of while we are borrowing from the past?
Yeah, well, you need first to identify the your inspiration. You know, it's a question. It's what I say all the time. You need to make sure that in terms of copyright, in terms of cultural appropriation, you're fine, and you acknowledge the property of the object that you're using, of the signature that you're producing there. Um, so first of all, yes, you need to acknowledge that. You need to make sure that there's no issues in terms of cultural appropriation, and that ethically you're approaching the creation fairly. Um, and then I think that it's important as well to use the resource that you have. Say, for example, coming back to Chanel, if they had worked with the knitters on the ferile knitters, maybe they would have avoided this literal interpretation
That's a good
of
point.
a ferile jumper. So connecting with the local communities who are the safeguards, but also the technicians in charge of this heritage would help to have a much more sensible and respectful approach of this type of inspiration.
That's great. Thank you so much. And also from a museum's point of view, we might have people from the heritage sector joining us
Absolutely,
today. And
absolutely.
what can museum and heritage sectors do to be a little bit more friendly in terms of including people to use their resources as inspiration for collections?
Yeah. Um, As a museum curator, I've never been shy at opening the doors of my of my storages, even though they were not the best one in in terms of standards. But we were doing well. We were doing as much as we could. So opening the doors, making sure that in the galleries you are showing a different type of objects and rotating them to stimulate the appetite from designers, uh, product makers of all sorts. So stimulate this appetite, opening your doors, working also from online collections, which is a fantastic resource today. I mean, museums have been really proactive at digitizing their collections, and that's a way we need to access, we can access easily this resource today. Um, I truly believe that museums are more than galleries and that their collections should be here to inspire even further.
Oh, that's really wonderful. Thank you so much. And I do know we're hitting our time. If folks have further questions,
I
please
think
submit them to Expo North.
I think there's a couple of questions.
Yes.
Um, so what
Yes.
do
What
you
would
want me
you
to do
advise
them?
us to consider
Okay,
to
right.
ensure the authenticity of storytelling with any project or collection, be that design or museum collection?
Um, right. So that's potentially something that we're going to cover in next webinar. Next webinar, I will have, well, I will have, no, I won't have. I've invited Sylvie Marot to come and speak with her curator's hat. And she's been working as well in the, and she's still working in the industry, heritage industry sector, sorry. And she will be with myself and also Alan Scott from Johnstons of Elgin to present the way the industry can
Great.
use this heritage in the creation process. Um, and potentially, this will be where we will go in more depth into this question, if that makes
Wonderful.
sense. And then there's a question from Ian. Do you think companies would welcome approaches from museums saying that they have resources and that you might think about a design based on this? Um, I think that we need to facilitate more and more the connections and the relationship between museums and industry. I think we have much more to do together than purely experiencing a visitor's a visit or something like that.
Yeah.
I think that the bonds between the industry and the creative sector needs to be much more stronger and fostered by a better knowledge of each other's, really. And maybe and that's what we're doing here, trying to open the door slightly and show and tell what is made by each of us.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you very, very much. Everyone, please join us for the next sessions, which are coming up soon. And again, please submit any additional questions to Expo North. We'll get them to Ode. But it's been a real pleasure. You've given us a lot of food for thought today. I'm going to be looking at how everyone's dressed very differently.
Absolutely, and you won't purchase your Christmas present in the same way, will you?
No, I'm going to look out for those little knitted balls. They look beautiful.
Right. So thank you very much, everyone. If you've got any question, I think, oh, we've missed the last slide. Oh no, there was the last slide with my contact details on it. Please don't hesitate to contact me. And also, due to copyright, the slides I think won't be available to you. But if you need an outline and if you have any question, I can answer your question. And of course, the webinar will be live, will be recorded, sorry, and available on the social media of Expono.
That's exactly right. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.